Hello and welcome to Nikolai's Genetics Lessons, and in this video I'm going to talk about general misunderstanding of how blood transfusion works. And in ABO blood group system, as far as you know, there are four blood groups, phenotypic blood groups: blood group A, blood group B, and blood group AB, and blood group O. These blood groups are made by 6 genotypes. For example, 2 genotypes make blood group A, genotype AA and AO. 2 genotypes make blood group B. This is BB genotype and BO. 1 genotype make blood group AB, and 1 genotype makes blood group O. So in this system, allele A, B, and O makes this phenotypic groups and this genotypic groups. So 3 alleles. Allele O is recessive to both allele B and allele A and B are codominant and both dominant to allele O. So basically, when we saying that someone has blood group A, we mean that this person belongs to any of these genotypes, and at the same time, this means that this person on the surface of the red blood cell has antigens, and here we have antigen A present on the surface of the red blood cell. Here in this genotype we see that 2 chromosomes have the same type of allele, and here we see that 2 chromosomes, of course we have 2 sets of chromosomes, one we inherited from mother side, another from the father side, so different variants are possible, as you see. So if we have one allele that is allele A, another is allele O, that basically means that here on the surface of the red blood cell we would have antigen A. Also allele O, on many pictures you wouldn't see here allele O, but allele O also would be a protein. It's only different from allele A, that allele A produce protein that produce immune response from organism if we would transfuse to different blood group. But allele O would be just a variant of this allele that doesn't produce immune response. So in order to make picture simple, I just don't put it here. We can say that this allele is not present at all. This is just for simplicity. And of course, in the serum of this blood group, we can find antibodies B present here. And if we consider red blood cells of the blood group B, once again, on the surface here we would find antigens B, and those who belong to the blood group genotype BO would just have these antigens present on the surface of the red blood cells, because only one chromosome would have this allele, and another chromosome wouldn't have this type of allele and would produce allele that doesn't produce immune response from the organism. So basically in the serum of this blood group we can find antibodies A, and if we consider blood group AB, here as you see only one genotype is possible, where we can find on the surface of the red blood cells both antigens A and B present, and in the serum or in the plasma of this blood, we don't have any antibodies. Otherwise, such antibodies would attack and kill the own red blood cells. And as for the blood group O, we agreed not to show this allele on the surface of the red blood cells, protein, which would be produced by this type of allele. We just say that it doesn't have any antigens at all. And in the plasma of this blood group, we can find both antibodies A and antibodies B. Now about general conception and misunderstanding. So you know that blood group O, those people who have this blood group considered to be universal donors, and those who belong to the blood group AB would be considered universal recipient. So now consider what would happen if we would transfuse this blood to a person who is who belong to the blood group AB. So red blood cells would be fine here, because this red blood cells doesn't contain any antigens on the surface, and plasma of this blood doesn't contain any antibodies. So this plasma or its antibodies wouldn't attack these red blood cells because this antibody is just absent. But imagine that we transfuse this blood that contains antibodies A and B, and these antibodies, antigens here, present. So plasma of this blood group would attack and kill red blood cells of the recipient. And the same would happen with blood group B and with blood group A. So why we call this blood group universal donor? Because when we say that this blood group universal donor, we only consider red blood cells. Basically, our blood consists of many components. One of them would be red blood cells. This is main component of the blood. This is why our blood is red. Another component would be a liquid portion of the blood, which we call plasma. And plasma is basically water, sugars, salts. It also contains hormones and some proteins and lipids. Next main component would be white blood cells that fight different diseases, and the last main component would be platelets. This component of the blood we need to stop bleeding. And basically, when we are saying that this blood group is a universal donor, we are saying that a person would be only universal donor of this component red blood cells. We actually, if we separate blood to its components, we can give this component to any of these recipients. Now let's turn our attention to so-called universal recipient people who belong to the blood group AB. Can these people also be universal recipient, for example, of the blood group B, which contains in the plasma antibodies A? No, because antibodies A would start attack recipient red blood cells. No, this blood group can get people who belong to this blood group the whole blood from the people who belong to the blood group A, because here plasma contains antibodies B, which start to attack and kill recipient own red blood cells. Once again, when we are saying that people who belong to this blood group are universal recipients, we only saying universal recipients of the red blood cells, but not the whole blood, not including this component of the blood which contains antibodies. So now let's clarify one more thing. As you know from the textbooks, people who belong to the blood group O plus Rh negative, but today I'm not talking about Rh factor at all. I want to clarify just this general misconception about ABO blood group system and blood transfusion. So these people who belong to this blood group actually can be considered not only universal donors of the red blood cells, but also can be considered universal recipients of the plasma. They can get plasma from people who belong to the blood group AB, because this plasma doesn't contain any antibodies. They can get plasma from people who belong to the blood group B. This plasma contains antibodies A, but antibodies A present here, and blood group O can get plasma from people who belong to the blood group A. Those here we find antibodies B, but antibodies B also present here. So, new conception. People who belong to the blood group O would be universal donors of the red blood cells, but at the same time would be universal recipients of the plasma from any of the other blood groups. And if you would take a look here, this blood group considered to be universal recipient, but from the point of view of plasma, this blood group can give its plasma to any of these blood groups. Once again, new conceptual idea. People who belong to this blood group would be considered universal recipients of red blood cells from any of the blood group, but at the same time would be considered universal donor of the plasma component of the blood. So basically now you understand that when we talk about blood transfusion, we talk about transfusion of the certain components of the blood. For example, if some person bleeding or has some disease when his red blood cells would be destroyed, example would be anemia, for example, and these people would get not the whole blood but only those components they need. Why not just to give the whole blood? Because here we see only main components of the blood that can produce immune response, and the least portion of the whole blood we give to the recipient, the least problems may arise because this is main components, but there are also that contain main antibodies, but also and antigens too, but also there are many other factors that produce mild effect. So when we separate blood to its different components, we reduce risk of immune response. And who may need this portion of the blood, liquid portion of the blood? People who dehydrated, for example. This can be sportsmen who lost a lot of weight through sweating, may need this portion of the blood because they have all the other components. They just lost a lot of water through sweating. And another example would be people who get wasted, drank too much alcohol and would have alcohol poisoning, and basically any other poisoning, they also would get this component. It's also can be substituted with artificial components such as basically it consists of water, sugars, and salts, so it can be made artificially. And these components of the blood, which are white blood cells, people would need whose immune system is compromised, for example, people who have AIDS, and their own white blood cells would be destroyed. So who would need platelets? People who have problems stopping bleeding. For example, those people who have hemophilia. They don't need all those components, but probably would need only this component of the blood. So if we need to transfuse the whole blood, of course in this case we have to transfuse people who belong to the blood group A from those people who also belong to the same blood group. And if a recipient would be someone who belongs to the blood group B, donor, the best way to transfuse the whole blood also have to be blood group B. And the same is true here and here. Then we wouldn't have immune response from the on the different components of the blood. Once again, before I finish, now you know that people who belong to the blood group O would be considered universal donors of the red blood cells. They can give to any other blood group the red blood cells, but at the same time these people would be considered universal recipients of the plasma. They can get plasma from any other blood group. And people who belong to the blood group AB would be considered universal recipients of the red blood cells, but at the same time would be considered universal donors of the plasma. And this is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Please subscribe for my new videos that I post almost every day. Thumbs up if you like this video. Please write your comments, questions if you have any. Share this video with your classmates. And see you in the next video. Goodbye.